Letter to my grandfather. Taxi 25. Biography. Normand Provost. And if I was talking about your life. To you, Grandpa, after the promise that dates for too long. In your last moments you asked me if I would write your story. I decided to put myself to the task this time. I hope that I will have the courage and the strength to maintain this project in the long term. I have many beautiful memories of you as a child. I wish you were still here to see where I am in my life. I often regretted your presence. I would have liked to introduce my friends. They would have loved you for sure. You had such a sense of humor. Always stories to tell. Tell me in your time, I always asked you when I was little. Today, it is I who will tell in your time, in your memory. Grandpa was born in Vermont in 1925. At the age of 2, his parents had moved back to Canada in Ville-Émard in Montreal. His parents were Canadian. He was the 5th child in the household. The first 3 children, however, died at a very young age, around 2 to 3 years, of very serious illnesses. His parents were still living in Vermont when the children died. He had a 2-year-old elder brother, followed by 4 other brothers and 4 sisters. His father had worked all his life as a kettle driver. His job was to shovel coal. He worked on shifts. Her mother was a housewife all her life. Vermont is a state in the northeastern United States. It is bordered to the north by the Canadian province of Quebec. Vermont is also known as the state of Green Mountains. A large francophone community resides there because of the proximity of Quebec. At that time it was economically very difficult because of the stock market crisis. About 1/3 of the population was unemployed and many Canadians depended on government assistance to survive. While household income was visibly melting, hundreds of thousands of people were reduced to soup kitchens. Until the Second World War the unemployment rate was very high. My grandfather lived for about 15 years in Ville-Émard, in a small house, with his parents, his brothers, and his sisters. The boys slept in the living room while the girls had a room and the parents had one too. There were sometimes bed bugs, so many bugs that he preferred to sleep on the floor rather than on the couch. He had left school at 16 to go to work to help support his family. At that time, a couple, Laforets, would have liked to adopt my grandfather. They were childless, knew my grandfather well and would have liked to offer him studies. Fortunately or unfortunately, his parents opposed this project. I say unfortunately, because he had the ease in school and he could have learned more and thus have a different life. However, I also say happily, because perhaps if it had been different I would not be here writing these pages about his life. At the age of 18, his parents had moved to the south shore of Montreal in St. Hubert. There were 3 similar houses. It was the center one. At that time, my grandfather worked in Ville-Émard. He had to take the train to work, which was not practical. So he took a room near his work shortly after his parents moved into their new home. Jobs. My grandfather has always worked in the transportation industry. His first job, for a certain businessman, was to make deliveries. Thanks to his support he was given the opportunity to get his first car, as well as a taxi permit. It was this man who had, so to speak, given him birth. My grandfather had always been a public man. He liked to listen to people. Of course, he liked to drive and talk. He worked for half a century, 48 years as a taxi driver. It was a career. It was almost a vocation. For the first 20 years he had worked tirelessly 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. He was driving his taxi in Montreal. The weekends were more hours. He could come back late at night or in the early hours of the morning. The taxi had often proved to be a second job. Always on the road, he had worked at General Steel War for 5 years. He had left this job due to the closure of the business. He was a trucker. He had also worked as a tram driver, but for a short time. The working hours being separated into 3 different quarters, it created a difficult schedule. He got up at 4 in the morning and was not at home until 9 in the evening. He was a little train driver in St. Henry. It was the first step before being able to drive the buses. However, he had not had the patience to keep this job until he got a bus driver position. He had nevertheless kept this work for a few years. My grandfather sold his taxi permit one day. It hurt him a lot and he regretted his gesture. Luckily, someone he knew in Villemerde had loaned him money to buy a taxi permit again, which he never sold. Then he had worked at Sears. The uniform as well as a vehicle was provided. In the morning, he had to take a businessman to his home to drive him to Sears. Then, all day he took care of the delivery of the post office. He went to the offices looking for the mail, which he then delivered. In the evening, he had to take the man home again. When he retired, it ended the job as it was. He did not have the car anymore, but during that time, he always kept his own car for a taxi. His wife and children saw him very little. He was always at work. It made my grandmother sad not to have her with her more often. While he made an exception sometimes to come to supper at home, she stared at him tenderly, which embarrassed my grandfather. Every day, however, he took a little time to call and get some news. His vocation, the taxi. The job of taxi driver was a real vocation for my grandfather. From sunrise till late at night he was sitting at the wheel of his taxi. He worked for 48 years. Never tired of driving his taxi, he took my grandmother on a walk after work and on Sunday. The Expo 67 and the Olympic Games held in Montreal in 1976 were a very good time for his job. Business was going really well at that time. The last years he had worked were much less lucrative. Some days became a source of great concern for him because he did not always have paid trips. This taxi driver out of the ordinary, had the passion of his job. He loved the road, but he also had a gift for communication. He knew how to adapt to any kind of clientele. Always smiling and in a good mood, he offered his chauffeur services. He had a thorough knowledge of the streets of Montreal and the South Shore. Driver and owner of his taxi, he had to do business with the radio distributor in his area to receive calls for transport requests. Otherwise, he could wait on the booth, a place to book taxis, to wait for customers. On occasion, he would have the opportunity to have a long trip to make. When this opportunity arose, he asked his client if he had any objection to my grandmother embarking with them for the road. In general, this did not cause any problem. My grandfather's taxi was number 25 and he worked for Union. His fellow workers nicknamed him Alfredo. On his death, the number of his taxi was removed, in his memory. Highlights. My grandfather met my grandmother at the neighborhood dance. It was the sweet season of spring. My grandmother used to dance with my grandfather's brother. My grandfather came to visit his family on the weekend and it was while going to the dance before taking the train to Villemerde that he met my grandmother. He had taken his brother's place without question to dance with her. He had asked her if she wanted to see him again the following week. She had given him his address. At that time his parents did not have the phone. Then she declined the invitation through her brother during the week. However, having exchanged ideas, she took the first steps to return to my grandfather. A box of chocolate was the first gift he had given him. It was during the Easter period. My grandparents married on July 24, 1948, at 9 o'clock in the morning at St. Jean-Eude Parish. They were 20 and 23 years old respectively. It was a beautiful day. My grandmother had taken care to hang her rosary on the clothesline the day before. It was a lucky tradition at that time for a successful wedding day. It was a simple ceremony, but with his guest batch. Kinship on both sides, cousins, all were there. There was no singing at the church, but the bells rang out blessing their union. The reception took place at the home of my grandmother's parents. To the good simplicity as it looks. A cold buffet, all that was simpler, but friendly, with the crusts on the tips of the sandwiches. A good old record player had filled the air with a happy rhythm for the occasion. A friend of my grandfather had come to add a touch of violin to the atmosphere in exchange for a few beers. At 4 o'clock, they had gone to the station, accompanied by a part of the family. They were going to travel to the Thousand Islands. It was the first trip they did together. They had traveled by train from Windsor Station. After the wedding, my grandparents lived with my grandmother's parents. It was for a short time because there was friction between my grandmother's father and her. In clearer terms, she found that her father was not involved in his affairs. The wedding took place in July and they left her father's home in the fall. They took the room that my grandfather had when he was younger in Villemerde. They had remained there for the whole period of the first pregnancy to my grandmother. On the eve of her delivery, they had moved back to my grandmother's parents. His father built an apartment block where they moved a few months later. In February their son was born and they took possession of the house in the autumn. The rent at that time was $30 a month for a 3.5 room. They had stayed in this dwelling for 8 years. Having become cramped with a second child, they had contemplated a move. Their daughter was born in May, 5 years after the birth of their son. So they bought their first house. A small house, 5 rooms, without basement. The heater was a large floor grill. Very effective according to my grandmother. The children each had their room. 2 years passed and they decided to sell and move. My grandmother did not like the area. They are then moving into Verdun in a very old home. There was vermin. They had only stayed there for a few months, then they had bought a new house. This time, on the south shore of Montreal. It was a bungalow. Then they decided to sell and move into a home in Côte St. Paul. They stayed there only 2 months and rearranged in the house they had just left. This time they stayed there for about 8 years. He had done a lot of renovations, such as enlarging the basement, bricking the facade and rebuilding the roof. When my grandmother started to get bored at one place, it was time to move. So after 8 years, the call of the move was felt again. They had bought a new house in a new neighborhood in Greenfield Park. Their daughter became seriously ill from being uprooted from her environment and her friends. So they had to move again. So they had gone back to their old house. There were several moves later. From a few months to a few years in different neighborhoods of St. Hubert and Greenfield Park. Her descendants. My grandfather was very religious. He had confided in a priest that he did not want a big family as the church asked. The priest reassured him by telling him to lead a good life and not to worry. After their marriage, my grandparents had welcomed a first child, a son, and 5 years later a girl. He was a good husband and a good father. He supplied his people as needed. He had a good heart. His son will be the first to leave the family nest to marry a woman who will give birth to 2 daughters. A few years later, her married daughter will also give birth to 2 girls. His children having no son, the descendants of my grandfather will end so. Those who come after us keep in their memory our passage on the earth, until he leaves it in their turn. On the other hand, the writings remain and cross the time. 20 years ago, I sat down at a table to begin writing my grandfather's biography. On several occasions, a few years apart, I returned to my grandfather's book, never duly completed as I viewed it. I never forgot the promise made to my grandfather and wanted to fulfill his dream. A time of recovery. We are approaching the holiday season and I thought back to my grandfather in his beautiful coat with his used hat. It was sacred moments. A magical atmosphere had always reigned at home during this holiday season. Small dishes cooked especially for Christmas Eve. The smell of turkey, meat pies, and desserts. I remember how he particularly enjoyed desserts. He played the accordion tunes that filled our hearts with happiness. At one of those famous Christmas dinners at the restaurant where my grandparents were doing their reception, they had all offered us an angel. It was a little brooch, which I always have. I feel like it's a protection. My grandfather was very religious. Memories of grandfather. I remember a big wooden boat that my grandfather kept in his yard. On occasion he would take me there. There was a damp smell that I liked particularly. The paint was peeling everywhere. It was a privilege to be able to board. He always said he would renovate it and put it back in the water one day. I had volunteered to help him in his repair. At the front, on the hull, there was a big porthole in the opening floor. It impressed me a lot. Sometimes he opened the caisse. I could see the engines. He often took me to the convenience store to buy candy. It was a privileged time. There was also the tradition of donuts. Every Wednesday afternoon my grandparents came to dinner and took with them a full box of donuts. Often, I missed afternoon classes to go with him to town carrying envelopes in his taxi. I sat in the front seats on the stretchers. It was memorable moments. What I loved most was when I asked him to tell me in his time. Here are some anecdotes. There was the plum tree. What you need to know is that his family being very poor, the food was in limited ration. In a wooded area he had discovered a plum tree. To keep the secret, he had invented the story that a wasp nest was on this path. So, it was better to avoid this path. At a distance the other children had been away from his treasure for a while, but all was finally discovered. One of the stories I loved was the raft. With the help of an old car roof, he had made a raft. As a bargaining chip, clothespins, to cross the marsh. Only one day, malicious people had pierced the raft and ended it, despite efforts to repair it. It may seem simple as anecdote. That's all I remember. I loved this story when I was little. He had such a way of telling it. It was captivating. He said locusts gave molasses. It is that when one pressed a little on their heads, a small brownish droplet left their mouths. A sewing thread was attached to their abdomen and walked on a leash. He took us on a hunt for frogs and snakes. What a joy it was! I could not have wished better, grandfather. They are all full of little memories, but they are the ones who build the story of a life. He left his mark in our hearts by his mere presence. My parents rented a cottage in the Laurentians for the summer holidays. My grandparents came here for a few days. It was then that he had offered me my first penknife. It was a precious object. I could cut the wood with him. Whenever he came home, he took the time to play with my sister and me. All kinds of improvised games. We also played cards. The thief package. It seems that my grandfather was a bad loser and he did not let me win. I hardly remember that, my memory was about the time we spent together. One of the stories he told me had traumatized me. It was the dentist's. Accompanying a friend to the dentist for a tooth extraction, he had returned alone because his friend had died during the maneuver. What? I do not remember. I had to have a tooth extracted a few years ago and I was in all my states. Besides, I have 3 other teeth that should be torn off and I persist in keeping them because I'm too scared. He was afraid of the dentist too. He said that he would get his teeth fixed if one of his little girls became a dentist. I do not know how he could live without proper care all these years. I know Grandma said it was a derogatory remark when they went to relatives about her teeth. My grandfather was a big anxious. He worried about everything and nothing. An anecdote told by his children comes to testify. While he was on vacation in Gaspésie, at Mont Saint-Pierre more precisely, he had thought he saw UFOs. Silence, look. He was speaking to the rest of the family who was staring in the same direction as him, but saw nothing abnormal. It was that he saw lights in the mountain. The next morning, it turned out that it was old abandoned vehicles that were reflecting the lights of the headlights of cars on the road. One day he made us a game. It was titled, Life a Fight. I still have this game from elsewhere. Corn cobs were painted on plywood. There were small plastic ears in the store to eat corn, planted in the plywood. A wolf's head on a pivot crowned it all. Rifles carved out of wood and rubber bands made from tire trips as a projectile. The goal of the game, to reach a corn or the head of the wolf by projecting the elastic with the help of the rifle. This game, the life of a fight, reminds us, however, that every day is a fight to be fought. My grandfather's last fight was against cancer. His departure. No one in the family would ever believe that he would have left us so young. He was 69 years old. He seemed in good shape. It all started with a backache. It turned out he had a prostate problem. The pain medication had prevented him for a while from suffering from his back pain, but the pain had reappeared, more intense still. The doctors had discovered that it was an osteosarcoma. Bone cancer. It was strange, because about 2 years ago at a Christmas dinner at the family restaurant, he used to say calcium, calcium while cuddling. It was a joke at that moment. To return to cancer, the doctors had decided to operate on the back. Everything seemed to be fine, but it was not. I remember the masterly efforts he had made to relearn how to walk after his operation. It was terrible, when we know that a few months later, he would no longer be ours, but he had hope. While he was entitled to hospital leave, his greatest happiness was to see his court again. He had a passion for his job and people. He had an admirable career as a taxi driver throughout his life. He also had an excellent sense of humor, always a joke to tell and able to adapt to all the clienteles. He had made his mark in this world, in his own way. He had wonderful vineyards in his yard. Of vinegar, cedars, and roses. It was my mother who took the rose bush on her death. Under his huge tree in front of his home, he was planting impatient. His love was reflected in everything he was doing. A moment that had deeply overwhelmed me with sadness is his departure for another world. My mother had managed to get him a room at the Victor Gadbois house. This house is designed to accommodate people who are in the final stages of their illness. My mother must have been very persuasive to the staff of this house so there could be a place. He had left the hospital to find you in a more welcoming setting. When he had breathed his last, we were all there. One of the few occasions when at that time the whole family was reunited. After months in the hospital, he died, surrounded by his entire family. I had just lost a very important person in my life, my grandfather. It was a Sunday, August 14, 1994. A wonderful sunset was at the rendezvous. It was around 7 p.m. when he closed everyone's eyes. Conclusion. My grandfather was and always will be an exceptional man. Even after his departure, he remains alive in our hearts. Just before he left, he sent each of us a personal sentence. He said to me, "Take care of your animals." He also says, "Will you write my life?" I do not remember, Grandpa, if this request was addressed to me personally, but I wanted to fulfill your last wishes. I want you to know that today I am happy and that I share my life with a sensational man that I would have liked to introduce you in person, but between you and me, we know that you know him well. With your 5 jets, you overfly our home to bless our union. You were the only one to approve it. Soon we will leave this home for a new home. I doubt that you will not be a stranger to it. Thank you, Grandpa, for your reassuring presence throughout my life, again and again today. In memory of Normand Provost. 1925 to 1994.